The steam from the espresso machine hissed like a warning. In 3 seconds, everything would change. 8 men in dark suits had just walked through the door of Sunrise Coffee, and the petite barista behind the counter, the one everyone called Mouse because she barely spoke above a whisper, was about to remind them why you should never underestimate the quiet ones. But first, she had to finish this latte. The alarm clock screamed at 4:30 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 18 months. Elena Vasquez rolled out of her narrow twin bed in the studio apartment above Chen's Electronics, her bare feet touching the cold linoleum floor that had seen better decades. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The space was barely 300 square feet, furnished with whatever the previous tenant had left behind: a sagging couch that doubled as her dining table, a mini fridge that wheezed like an old man climbing stairs, and a single window that looked out onto the alley where the city's forgotten people sought shelter among the dumpsters. Elena stretched her compact frame, working out the kinks from sleeping on a mattress that had given up supporting dreams long ago. At 28, she stood barely 5'2", with shoulder-length black hair that she kept simple and straight, and dark eyes that most people never bothered to meet. She had the kind of face that disappeared in crowds, unremarkable in every way that mattered to a world obsessed with standing out, which was exactly how she preferred it. The shower in her tiny bathroom produced water that was either scalding or freezing, with no comfortable middle ground. Elena had learned to work with scalding. She stood under the punishing stream for exactly 4 minutes, washing her hair with the cheapest shampoo the corner store sold, using soap that came in industrial-sized bars because it lasted longer. Every dollar mattered when you were earning minimum wage plus tips that barely covered rent in a city that devoured the dreams of people like her. By 5:15, she was dressed in her uniform, black jeans that had been washed so many times they were more gray than black, a dark green polo shirt with Sunrise Coffee embroidered in fading yellow thread, and white sneakers that she'd bought at a thrift store and bleached back to something resembling their original color. She tied her hair back in a simple ponytail, applied no makeup because she couldn't afford it and didn't see the point, and grabbed the small backpack that contained everything important she owned. The walk to work took exactly 12 minutes. If she maintained a steady pace, Elena had timed it dozens of times, mapping out the most efficient route through streets that were still dark at this hour, past storefronts protected by metal grates in apartment buildings where other invisible people were just beginning to stir. She knew which sidewalks had the fewest cracks, which intersections had working streetlights, and which alleys to avoid even though they might save her a minute or two. Sunrise Coffee occupied the corner of 5th and Meridian, wedged between a check cashing place and a cell phone repair shop that had been temporarily closed for 8 months. The coffee shop's exterior was nothing special: faded brick walls, windows that hadn't been properly cleaned in years, and a hand-painted sign that had been touched up so many times the letters looked more like suggestions than actual words. But it served the neighborhood, and the neighborhood was all Elena needed. She used her key to unlock the back door, disabled the basic alarm system that probably wouldn't deter anyone seriously intent on breaking in, and began the opening routine she could perform in her sleep. Lights on throughout the shop, revealing mismatched furniture that had been donated, inherited, or rescued from the curb. The counter was scarred wood that had been sanded and refinished by someone who cared more about function than beauty. Behind it, the espresso machine that was older than Elena, but still produced decent coffee if you knew how to coax it properly. The morning prep was a meditation of sorts. Elena measured coffee beans by sound, knowing exactly how the grinder hummed when it had the right amount. She checked the milk supply, verified that the pastry case was stocked with day-old items from the bakery 3 blocks over, and made sure the register had enough small bills to handle the customers who paid. with cash because they didn't trust banks or couldn't qualify for credit cards. At 6:30 sharp, she unlocked the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open. Then she took her position behind the counter and became invisible. The morning rush at Sunrise Coffee wasn't like those frantic scenes in downtown. Establishments where suited professionals barked orders at harried baristas. Here, the pace was different. Construction workers grabbed black coffee and maybe a donut before heading to job sites. Night shift workers from the hospital bought whatever would help them sleep through the day. Elderly residents from the senior housing complex ordered decaf and stayed to read newspapers they couldn't afford to buy. Elena served them all with quiet efficiency, remembering their usual orders without being asked, making change without small talk, existing in the background of their morning routines, like the hum of fluorescent lights or the whisper of traffic. Outside, she was the coffee girl to most of them, if they thought of her at all. Some called her Mouse because she spoke in barely audible tones and seemed to shrink away from direct interaction. "Morning, Mouse," said Frank Delgado as he shuffled through the door at 7:15, just like he had every weekday for the past year. Frank worked security at the office building 6 blocks east, a job that required him to wear a uniform that made him look official and carry a radio that mostly picked up static. He was in his 50s, with gray stubble and shoulders that had started to curve inward from decades of disappointment. "The usual, honey." Elena nodded and reached for the large cup, filling it with black coffee that was strong enough to wake. "The dead." Frank liked it bitter, no sugar, no cream, nothing to soften the harsh reality of another day, spent watching empty hallways and checking doors that nobody wanted to open. She handed it to him along with his change, their fingers never quite touching, her eyes focused somewhere past his left shoulder. "Thanks, kid," Frank said, leaving a $1 tip that he probably couldn't afford, but always provided anyway. "You take care of yourself." Elena nodded again, already turning toward the next customer, a woman in scrubs who needed enough caffeine to survive a 12-hour shift at the clinic. The exchange took less than 30 seconds, and neither participant would remember it by lunchtime. That's how Elena preferred these interactions: brief, functional, forgettable. The coffee shop's owner, Mrs. Park, arrived around 9:30, after the initial rush had subsided and before the afternoon crowd began to trickle in. Mrs. Park was a Korean woman in her 60s who had bought the failing business 3 years ago with her retirement savings, determined to create something that would serve the community and maybe, eventually, turn a modest profit. She was kind in the way that people who had survived real hardship could be kind, understanding that everyone carried invisible burdens. "Good morning, Elena," Mrs. Park said as she entered through the back door, hanging her purse on a hook behind the counter. She was one of the few people who used Elena's real name, who looked directly at her when speaking, who treated her like a human being rather than a convenient appliance for dispensing caffeine. "Morning, Mrs. Park," Elena replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "The delivery from Metropolitan came early. I signed for it and put everything in the back cooler." Mrs. Park nodded approvingly. Elena had been working at Sunrise Coffee for 18 months, and in that time, she had never been late, never called in sick, never made a mistake with the register, and never given Mrs. Park a reason to worry about the business when she wasn't there. The older woman had tried, especially in the early months, to draw Elena out, to learn something about her background or her dreams or her life outside the coffee shop. But Elena deflected personal questions with the same quiet efficiency she used to make lattes, providing just enough information to seem responsive while revealing absolutely nothing of substance. "There's a new apartment complex opening up on 7th Street," Mrs. Park mentioned as she began reviewing the previous day's receipts. "Nice places, from what I hear. 2 bedrooms, modern appliances. Might be something to think about." Elena continued wiping down the espresso machine, her movements steady and methodical. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I'm fine where I am, Mrs. Park. Thank you for thinking of me. It was the same response she gave whenever Mrs. Park suggested improvements to Elena's living situation. Her wardrobe, her social life, or her obvious intelligence that was being wasted on a job that required no education beyond knowing the difference between regular and decaf. Elena had learned that people eventually stopped offering help if you declined it politely and consistently enough. Even the well-meaning ones like Mrs. Park would eventually accept that some people preferred to remain exactly where they were. The midday lull was Elena's favorite time. Between 11 and 2, the coffee shop was usually empty except for the occasional customer seeking refuge from the heat or the cold, depending on the season. Elena used these quiet hours to clean equipment that didn't need cleaning, organize inventory that was already organized, and read books she borrowed from the public library's branch 3 blocks away. Today she was working through a collection of short stories by authors she'd never heard of, finding comfort in tales about people whose problems were contained within a few pages and resolved by the time she reached the end. Fiction was safer than reality because fictional characters couldn't disappoint you with their choices, couldn't leave you when you needed them most, couldn't die in places where you couldn't follow. Elena read while sitting on a stool behind the counter, the book positioned so she could see anyone approaching the front door. She had developed the ability to absorb written words while maintaining awareness of her surroundings, a skill that served her well in a neighborhood where situational awareness could mean the difference between getting home safely and not getting home at all. At 2:30, the afternoon crowd began to arrive. These were different people from the morning rush, students from the community college carrying backpacks full of dreams they weren't sure they could afford. Mothers with young children who needed somewhere warm to sit while their older kids finished school. Elderly men who had nowhere else to go and enough loose change for a small coffee that they could nurse for hours. Elena served them all with the same quiet efficiency, remembering that Mrs. Rodriguez liked extra foam on her cappuccino. That teenage Marcus always ordered a hot chocolate even though he was trying to convince his friends he drank coffee. That old Mr. Thompson needed his cup filled only halfway because arthritis made it difficult for him to hold anything heavier. She listened to fragments of conversation without appearing to pay attention. Complaints about landlords who wouldn't fix broken heaters, celebrations of grandchildren's achievements, worries about medical bills and car repairs, and whether social security would be enough to cover groceries this month. Elena absorbed these stories like a sponge, filing away details about lives she would never be part of, accumulating knowledge about a community that saw her as furniture. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice belonged to a man Elena hadn't noticed entering. He was tall, probably in his 30s, wearing an expensive suit that looked out of place in Sunrise Coffee. His hair was perfectly styled. His shoes were polished leather that had never touched a dirty sidewalk, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never been told no about anything that mattered. Elena looked up from the book she'd been reading, marking her place with a finger before closing it and setting it aside. The man was standing at the counter with 2 other men who were dressed similarly, all suits, all polished, all radiating the kind of authority that came from having money and connections and the absolute certainty that the world existed to accommodate their needs. "What can I get you?" Elena asked, her voice maintaining its characteristic whisper. The first man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "We're looking for information about someone who used to work around here. Military background, probably going by a different name. Have you seen anyone like that?" Elena's expression didn't change, but something cold settled in her stomach. "I just serve coffee. I don't really pay attention to customers' backgrounds." "Cute," said the second man, leaning against the counter in a way that was meant to seem casual but felt threatening. "The thing is, we know she's in this neighborhood." Someone with very specific skills, very specific training. Someone who might be trying to blend in. "I'm sorry," Elena said, reaching for a cup. "Can I get you something to drink or ... The third man, who had been quiet until now, stepped closer to the counter. "My friends here are being polite, but I'm not in a polite mood. We're looking for someone, and we're going to find her. Now you can make this easy and tell us what you know, or you can make it difficult and deal with the consequences." Elena set down the cup and looked directly at the third man for the first time. Her dark eyes were calm, almost sleepy, but there was something underneath that calmness that might have worried him if he had been paying better attention. "I serve coffee," she repeated, her voice still barely above a whisper. "That's all I do here. If you're not ordering anything, maybe you should leave. Mrs. Park doesn't like it when people loiter." The first man's smile became colder. "Mrs. Park isn't here right now. In fact, it's just you and us, and this conversation can go however we want it to go." Elena glanced around the coffee shop, confirming what she already knew. It was empty except for the four of them. The afternoon crowd had cleared out, and the evening customers wouldn't start arriving for another hour. Even if someone walked in right now, they would probably assume this was just a normal conversation between a barista and some customers. Nothing worth getting involved in. "Look," the second man said, his tone shifting to what he probably thought was reasonable. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to find someone, and when we find her, everyone can go back to their normal lives. But right now, you're the only person standing between us and what we need." Elena nodded slowly, as if she were considering this information. "And what happens if I can't help you find whoever you're looking for?" The third man's laugh had no humor in it. "Then we'll have to assume you're being uncooperative, and we'll need to persuade you to be more helpful." "I see," Elena said quietly. She reached under the counter as if she were looking for something, her movements slow and non-threatening. "So you're telling me that you came into my workplace, threatened me, and now you're planning to hurt me if I don't give you information I don't have about someone I've never met." "We're telling you," the first man said, his patience clearly wearing thin, "that you need to start taking this seriously." Elena's hand found what she'd been reaching for under the counter. Not a weapon, not a phone, but a small towel she used to clean the espresso machine. She began wiping her hands with it, her movements casual and methodical, as if the three men weren't standing there radiating menace. "Here's what I think," she said, her voice still maintaining that characteristic whisper that made people lean forward to hear her properly. "I think you three made a mistake coming in here. I think you're looking for someone who doesn't want to be found. And I think you've been looking for a long time without success. I think you're frustrated and tired and probably under pressure from whoever sent you to produce results." The second man straightened up, his casual pose forgotten. "Lady, you have no idea what you're dealing with here." Elena continued wiping her hands, her dark eyes moving from one man to another with an almost sleepy calmness. "I think you came in here because you thought you could intimidate a small woman who works in a coffee shop in a poor neighborhood. I think you assumed I'd be scared of you, that I'd tell you whatever you wanted to hear just to make you go away." "Smart girl," the third man said. "So let's skip to the part where you tell us what we want to know." Elena folded the towel neatly and set it on the counter. When she looked up again, something had changed in her posture, in the way she held her head, in the quality of attention she was giving them. It was subtle, the kind of thing that might not be noticeable unless you were trained to recognize the signs of a predator, deciding whether to reveal itself. "But here's the thing," Elena said, her whisper carrying more weight than their raised voices had managed. "I think you're right about one thing. There is someone in this neighborhood with military training, someone with very specific skills, who's been hiding in plain sight." The three men exchanged glances, sensing victory. The first man leaned forward eagerly. "Now we're getting somewhere. Where is she?" Elena smiled for the first time since they'd walked in. And it was nothing like the polite, forgettable expression she usually wore when serving customers. This smile was different, sharp, confident, and completely without warmth. "She's standing right behind this counter," Elena said quietly. "And she's getting really tired of being threatened in her place of work." The coffee shop fell silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic outside. The three men stared at Elena as if they were seeing her for the first time, taking in the compact frame, the unremarkable clothes, the mousy hair, and trying to reconcile these observations with what she had just told them. "You," the first man said, incredulity clear in his voice. "You're what we've been looking for?" Elena shrugged, a gesture so ordinary it seemed absurd, given the circumstances. "Elena Vasquez isn't my real name, and serving coffee isn't my real job. But being underestimated? That's always been one of my greatest assets." The second man took a step back, his hand moving instinctively toward his jacket. "There's no way. We've been tracking someone with serious capabilities, someone dangerous. Not some what?" Elena asked, tilting her head slightly. "Some minimum wage worker who lives in a studio apartment and reads library books? Someone so forgettable that customers don't even look at her face when they order coffee?" The third man was studying Elena more carefully now, looking for signs he had missed, clues that might have warned him he was dealing with something other than a helpless civilian. "Prove it," he said finally. Elena reached under the counter. Again, this time pulling out a small device that looked like a cell phone, but clearly wasn't. She pressed a button, and immediately, the men's own phones began buzzing with incoming messages. "Your names are David Richardson, Marcus Cole, and Tony Brennan," Elena said, reading from the device's screen. "David, you're divorced. 2 kids you see every other weekend, and you owe your bookie $12,000. Marcus, your mother doesn't know you work for people who threaten civilians, and she'd be heartbroken if she found out. Tony, that scar on your left hand is from a knife fight in Berlin 3 years ago, and the person who gave it to you is still looking for you." The three men stared at her in stunned silence as Elena continued. "You're working for Vincent Chun, who runs operations out of a warehouse in Industrial District 7. You were hired to find someone called Sierra, who disappeared 18 months ago, after a job went sideways in Southeast Asia. Chun thinks Sierra has something that belongs to him, and he's getting impatient." Elena set the device on the counter where all three men could see it. "The thing is, Chun is right about one thing. Sierra does have something that belongs to him. Unfortunately for Chun, what she has is a very detailed record of his entire operation, including financial records, personnel files, and documentation of activities that would interest several federal agencies." David Richardson found his voice first. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Elena asked. She pressed another button on the device, and a new message appeared on their phones. A photograph of Vincent Chun meeting with known criminal associates, time-stamped and geolocated with precision that left no doubt about its authenticity. Marcus Cole was backing toward the door now, his face pale. "This is insane. You're just a barista." Elena laughed softly, and the sound was nothing like the timid whisper they had been hearing for the past few minutes. "Marcus, I've been a lot of things. I've been a daughter, a soldier, a ghost, a weapon, and a disappointment to people who expected better from me. But for the past 18 months, I've been something much more dangerous than any of those things." "What's that?" Tony Brennan asked, though his voice suggested he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Elena picked up the towel again and began wiping down the counter with the same methodical movements she had used earlier. But now, those movements looked different to the three men watching her. Now they could see the economy of motion, the controlled precision, the absolute confidence of someone who had trained her body to be a tool. "I've been patient," Elena said quietly. "I've been waiting for Vincent Chun to make exactly this kind of mistake. I've been watching, learning, documenting, and preparing for the day when he would send people to find me. She looked up from her cleaning, meeting each man's eyes in turn. "Congratulations, gentlemen, today is that day." The silence that followed was broken by the sound of the front door opening. Mrs. Park entered, carrying bags of supplies from the grocery store, humming a Korean song under her breath. She stopped when she saw the three men standing frozen near the counter. Elena behind it holding a cleaning towel, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "Oh," Mrs. Park said, looking from Elena to the visitors. "I'm sorry, I didn't realize we had customers. Elena, is everything all right?" Elena smiled at Mrs. Park with the same gentle expression she had worn every day for 18 months. "Everything's fine, Mrs. Park. These gentlemen were just leaving." David Richardson opened his mouth as if to speak, but Elena gave him a look. That made him reconsider. The three men filed toward the door in silence. Their previous confidence evaporated like steam from an overheated espresso machine. As they reached the exit, Elena called after them, her voice returning to its characteristic whisper. "Gentlemen, please tell Mr. Chun that Sierra sends her regards. And remind him that some people are much more dangerous when they're trying to live peaceful lives." The door closed behind them with a gentle chime from the bell Mrs. Park had installed to announce customers. Elena returned to wiping down the counter as if nothing had happened, while Mrs. Park began unpacking groceries with her usual efficiency. "Elena," Mrs. Park said after several minutes of comfortable silence, "I've always wondered about something." Elena looked up, her expression politely attentive. "What's that, Mrs. Park?" The older woman paused in her unpacking, holding a container of coffee beans, as if it might provide answers to questions she had never dared to ask. "You're very good at this job. Too good, maybe. Like someone who's been trained to notice everything and remember details that other people miss." Elena nodded slowly. "I suppose I have a good memory for customer preferences." "That's not what I mean," Mrs. Park said gently. "I mean you move like someone who's been trained to move efficiently. You watch the door like someone who's been trained to watch for threats. You speak quietly like someone who's been trained to avoid drawing attention." Elena set down the towel and looked directly at Mrs. Park, the same woman who had given her a job when she needed to disappear, who had never asked questions when Elena paid her first month's rent in cash, who had accepted a fake name and a false history because she understood that sometimes people needed fresh starts. "Mrs. Park," Elena said quietly, "are you asking if I used to be someone else?" The older woman smiled sadly. "I'm asking if the person you used to be is someone you're trying to forget, or someone you're trying to protect." Elena considered this question while outside. Evening shadows began to lengthen across Fifth Street. Somewhere in the city, three men were reporting their failure to Vincent Chun. Somewhere else, federal agents were receiving anonymous tips about criminal activities in Industrial District 7. And here in Sunrise Coffee, two women who had both learned to survive by adapting to circumstances beyond their control were sharing a moment of understanding that neither would ever put into words. "Both," Elena said finally. "I think it's both." Mrs. Park nodded and returned to unpacking groceries. "Well," she said matter-of-factly, "whoever you used to be, I'm grateful for who you are now. You make excellent coffee, you're reliable, and you're kind to customers who need kindness." "Thank you, Mrs. Park. But Elena?" "Yes?" "If you ever need help with anything at all, you know where to find me." Elena smiled, and for once, it reached her eyes. "I know. Thank you." As the evening crowd began to trickle in, Elena resumed her position behind the counter, serving coffee with the same quiet efficiency she had maintained for 18 months. But something had changed in the coffee shop that afternoon, something subtle but unmistakable. The air felt different, charged with possibility and danger in equal measure. Because Elena Vasquez, who wasn't really Elena Vasquez, had spent 18 months building a life where she could be invisible, unremarkable, safe. She had created an identity so thoroughly ordinary that it became the perfect camouflage for someone who needed to disappear completely. But Vincent Chun's men had found her anyway, which meant her time of being invisible was coming to an end. Soon, Elena would have to decide whether to run again, to find another city and another identity and another job where she could blend into the background of other people's lives. Or she could stop running and remember what it felt like to be the person she used to be before she became a ghost haunting coffee shops and studio apartments. She could remember what it felt like to be Sierra, the woman who had earned her place among the most elite soldiers in the world, who had completed missions that officially never happened in places that didn't exist on any map. The woman who had learned that sometimes the most effective way to fight monsters was to become something even more dangerous than they were. As Elena served her last customer of the day and began closing procedures, she made her decision. Tomorrow she would give Mrs. Park her notice. Tomorrow she would pack her few belongings and disappear from Sunrise Coffee, just as thoroughly as she had appeared 18 months ago. But tonight she would make one phone call to a number she had memorized but never used. A number that would connect her to people who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. Vincent Chun had made a mistake sending his men to threaten her in the place where she had tried to build something resembling a normal life. He had forced her to remember who she really was, and that was a memory that would prove fatal for everyone involved in hunting her. The mouse was done hiding. It was time for Sierra to come home. The warehouse district at 3 in the morning was a graveyard of abandoned dreams and broken promises. Elena moved through the shadows between buildings like smoke, her footsteps silent on cracked asphalt that had been baking under the sun for decades. She wore black tactical pants, a dark hoodie, and running shoes that had been modified for maximum silence and grip. The transformation from coffee shop worker to predator had taken less than an hour, but the mindset shift had been instantaneous. In her previous life, before she became a ghost serving lattes to strangers, Elena had been Staff Sergeant Sofia Rivera, call sign Sierra, of the Army's 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta. She had earned her place among the most elite soldiers in the world through a combination of natural talent, relentless training, and an ability to remain calm under pressure that bordered on supernatural. For 8 years, she had completed missions that required her to become anyone, go anywhere, and eliminate threats that posed risks to national security. Then Cambodia happened. Elena pushed the memory away as she approached the perimeter of Vincent Chun's operation. The warehouse complex sprawled across 4 city blocks, a maze of corrugated metal buildings, loading docks, and chain-link fences topped with razor wire. During daylight hours, it looked like any other industrial facility, complete with legitimate businesses that provided convenient cover for activities that occurred after dark. She had spent the past 6 hours conducting surveillance from 3 different vantage points, mapping guard rotations, identifying security cameras, and cataloging entry and exit points. Chun employed 12 full-time security personnel, most of them former military or law enforcement who had been discharged for reasons that made them unemployable in legitimate positions. They were competent enough to handle ordinary threats, but woefully unprepared for someone with Elena's training and motivation. The first guard never saw her coming. He was stationed at the northeast corner of the complex, smoking cigarettes and scrolling through social media on his phone instead of watching the approaches to the facility. Elena appeared behind him like a shadow-gaining substance, one hand covering his mouth while the other applied pressure to his carotid artery. He was unconscious in 4 seconds, secured with zip ties and hidden behind a dumpster in 8. Elena took his radio, his keys, and his sidearm, then moved toward the main building where Chun conducted his business meetings, the intelligence she had gathered during 18 months of patient investigation told her that Chun would be here tonight, meeting with associates who helped him move merchandise that ranged from stolen electronics to human trafficking. She had documented every aspect of his operation, building a case that could have put him in federal prison for life. But Elena wasn't interested in arrests or trials or justice served through legitimate channels. She was interested in sending a message that would resonate through every criminal organization in the city. Some people were too dangerous to hunt. The second guard was patrolling the eastern perimeter, following a route that took him past the loading docks every 15 minutes. Elena intercepted him between two shipping containers, striking with surgical precision. Her hands moved in a blur of controlled violence that left him unconscious and cable-tied before he could react. She dragged his body into the shadows and continued moving toward the main building. Through the windows of Chun's office, she could see 5 men seated around a conference table, discussing business with the casual indifference of people who had never faced real consequences for their actions. Chun sat at the head of the table, a thin man in his 50s with expensive clothes and the kind of soft hands that suggested he let other people handle the messy aspects of his work. The 3 men Elena had encountered at the coffee shop were there, along with someone she didn't recognize who carried himself like former military. Elena activated the recording device hidden in her tactical vest and began documenting the conversation. Within 20 minutes, she had captured enough incriminating evidence to destroy Chun's organization and everyone associated with it. Bank account numbers, shipping routes, contact information for corrupt officials, and detailed discussions of future criminal activities flowed through her recording equipment like water through a net. But evidence gathering was only the beginning of her plan. Elena made her way to the building's electrical system, located in a utility room that was protected by a lock that took her less than 30 seconds to defeat. She connected a device to the main power distribution panel, something she had acquired through contacts who specialized in equipment that didn't officially exist. With a few keystrokes on her phone, she could now control every light, security camera, and electronic lock in the complex. The 3rd and 4th guards were stationed at the building's main entrance, more focused on their conversation about sports betting than on potential security threats. Elena disabled them simultaneously, using techniques she had perfected during operations in places where silence meant the difference between mission success and international incidents. Their unconscious bodies joined the others in shadowy hiding places where they wouldn't be discovered until morning. Elena entered the building through a maintenance door that led directly to the basement, where Chun stored merchandise that he preferred to keep away from casual inspection. The basement was a catalog of criminal enterprise, stolen artwork, illegal weapons, drugs packaged for distribution, and electronic equipment that had been acquired through methods that violated numerous federal laws. She planted the first explosive device behind a stack of computers that were destined for overseas markets, where questions about their provenance wouldn't be asked. The device was small, precisely calibrated, and designed to create maximum psychological impact with minimal structural damage. Elena wasn't trying to kill anyone tonight. She was trying to deliver a message that would be understood by people who responded only to demonstrations of superior force. The 5th guard was stationed in the hallway outside Chun's office, positioned where he could monitor anyone approaching the meeting. Elena approached from behind, moving through corridors she had memorized from building schematics she had obtained through sources that Chun would never think to investigate. By the time the guard realized he wasn't alone, he was already unconscious and being dragged into an empty office. Elena could hear voices from Chen's meeting as she prepared the second explosive device, a slightly larger version of the first that would be placed in the building's main conference room. Chun was discussing the shipment of stolen pharmaceuticals that would be arriving from Mexico within the week, detailing distribution methods that would put dangerous medications into the hands of people who would sell them to desperate patients who couldn't afford legitimate prescriptions. The conversation confirmed what Elena already knew about Chun's operation. He was responsible for suffering that extended far beyond simple theft or fraud. His activities destroyed lives, broke families, and contributed to social problems that affected entire communities. The federal agencies that were now receiving Elena's anonymous tips would eventually build cases that might result in arrests and prosecutions. But that process would take years, and Chun would likely escape serious consequences through legal maneuvering and political connections. Elena had a more immediate solution in mind. She placed the second device in the conference room's ventilation system, where it would be invisible but perfectly positioned to create maximum dramatic effect. Then she made her way to Chun's private office, where she planted the third and final device in his personal safe. The safe's combination had been included in the intelligence package she had compiled, along with information about Chin's personal habits, financial accounts, and security arrangements. The office itself was a monument to Chun's ego. Expensive furniture, original artwork, and photographs showing him with politicians and business leaders who probably had no idea they were being used to legitimize his criminal activities. Elena photographed everything, adding to the evidence file that would soon be delivered to multiple federal agencies simultaneously. But first, she had a more personal message to deliver. Elena activated her phone and accessed the building's electrical systems, plunging the warehouse complex into complete darkness. Emergency lighting kicked in after a few seconds, casting everything in a dim red glow that made the familiar environment suddenly ominous and threatening. She could hear voices from the conference room, confusion and concern replacing the casual confidence that had characterized Chin's meeting. She accessed the building's sound system next, connecting her phone to speakers throughout the complex. When she spoke, her voice echoed from every corner of the facility, calm and professional despite the circumstances. "Good evening, Mr. Chun. My name is Sierra, and I believe your associates have been looking for me." The voices from the conference room fell silent. Elena could imagine the expressions on their faces as they realized that their hunter had become their prey, that the mouse they had been seeking had revealed herself to be something much more dangerous. "For the past 18 months, Elena continued, her voice carrying through speakers that had been designed for mundane announcements about shipping schedules and safety procedures, I've been documenting your operation. Financial records, personnel, files, supplier contacts, customer lists, law enforcement connections, and detailed evidence of criminal activities that span multiple federal jurisdictions." Elena moved through the darkened building like a ghost, her night vision equipment allowing her to navigate corridors that had become mazes for anyone dependent on emergency lighting. She could hear movement from Chun's office, the sounds of people trying to establish control over a situation that had already spiraled beyond their comprehension. This evidence has been compiled into packages that are currently being delivered to the FBI, DATF, ICE, and several other agencies whose acronyms you probably don't recognize but whose attention you definitely don't want. By morning, your operation will be the subject of multiple federal investigations. Elena reached the conference room and positioned herself where she could observe Chun's meeting through a window that had been tinted to prevent anyone from seeing inside during normal lighting conditions. The emergency lighting had reversed that advantage, allowing her to watch 5 men who were quickly realizing that they had made a catastrophic mistake. Chun was on his feet now, speaking rapidly into his phone, trying to coordinate a response to a threat he didn't fully understand. The 3 men who had visited Elena's coffee shop were armed and alert, but they were scanning empty corridors for an enemy who could be anywhere. The 5th man, the one Elena didn't recognize, was methodically checking security monitors that showed only empty spaces and unconscious guards. "However," Elena continued, her voice maintaining the same professional calm that had characterized her radio communications during military operations, "federal investigations take time, and I'm not feeling particularly patient tonight." Elena activated the first explosive device, the one she had planted in the basement. The detonation was precisely calibrated, loud enough to be heard throughout the building, powerful enough to destroy Chun's stored merchandise, but contained enough to avoid structural damage that might threaten innocent people in neighboring facilities. The sound echoed through the warehouse complex like thunder, followed by the unmistakable smell of smoke and burning electronics. The men in the conference room were moving now, abandoning their meeting in favor of escape routes that Elena had already anticipated and blocked. She activated the second device, planted in the conference room's ventilation system. This explosion was smaller but more psychologically effective, filling the room with smoke that made breathing difficult and visibility nearly impossible. "Mr. Chun," Elena said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a blade, "you made a mistake. When you sent your people to threaten me, you forced me to remember who I used to be, and that's a memory that's going to prove fatal for your organization." Elena could see Chun through the smoke and emergency lighting, a man who had built his power through intimidation and violence, but who had never faced an enemy who possessed superior training, better equipment, and absolute commitment to mission completion. He was shouting orders that no one could follow, making threats that carried no weight, trying to impose control over a situation that had been designed to demonstrate his complete powerlessness. The third device was the largest, planted in Chun's personal safe where he kept the most sensitive information about his operation. Elena activated it remotely, and the explosion that followed was visible through the windows of his office, a brief flash of light that illuminated the entire warehouse complex before fading back to emergency lighting. "Your financial records, your contact information, your insurance policies, and your escape routes have all been destroyed," Elena announced through the speaker system. "The only copies that exist now are in the hands of federal agents who are very interested in meeting you." Elena moved to the building's exit, her mission nearly complete. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of confusion and panic as Chin's organization collapsed in real time. His guards were unconscious, his merchandise was destroyed, his records were gone, and his meeting had been replaced by a demonstration of how vulnerable he actually was. But Elena wasn't finished yet. She had one more message to deliver, something that would ensure Chun understood the full scope of his mistake. Elena activated her phone again, this time accessing Chun's personal devices through back doors she had installed months ago during her intelligence-gathering phase. His phone, his laptop, and his tablet all displayed the same message simultaneously, a photograph of Elena in her military uniform, wearing the distinctive beret of Delta Force, standing with her unit after a successful mission in Afghanistan. Below the photograph was a simple text message. "Some people are more dangerous when they're trying to live peaceful lives. You should have left the mouse alone." Elena exited the building and made her way back through the warehouse complex, moving past unconscious guards and disabled security systems toward the perimeter fence she had crossed hours earlier. Behind her, Chun's operation was literally going up in smoke, 18 months of careful planning culminating in a single night of precision violence that would be remembered long after the fires were extinguished. As she reached the fence, Elena's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number she recognized, Mrs. Park. Elena considered ignoring the call, but something made her answer. "Elena?" Mrs. Park's voice was concerned, but not panicked. "I just wanted to make sure you're all right. I saw the news about fires in the warehouse district, and I know you live over there." Elena paused in her escape, touched by the older woman's concern for someone she barely knew, someone who had lied about her identity and her background from the moment they met. "I'm fine, Mrs. Park. Thank you for checking on me." "Good." Was worried. These days, you never know what kind of trouble people can get into. "No," Elena said quietly, looking back at the warehouse complex where Chun's criminal empire was burning. "You really don't." "Elena, I hope you know that you always have a job at Sunrise Coffee if you need one. No matter what happens, no matter where you've been or what you've done, there's always a place for you here." Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the warmth of unconditional acceptance from someone who asked for nothing in return. "Thank you, Mrs. Park. That means more to me than you know. Take care of yourself, dear. And if you need anything, you know where to find me." The call ended, and Elena climbed over the perimeter fence, disappearing into the maze of streets that surrounded the warehouse district. Behind her, sirens were beginning to wail as fire departments and police units responded to reports of explosions and smoke. Soon, federal agents would arrive to find a crime scene that had been perfectly prepared for their investigation, complete with evidence that would keep prosecutors busy for years, but Elena wouldn't be there to see it. By morning, she would be gone from the city, vanished as completely as she had appeared 18 months earlier. Elena Vasquez, the quiet barista who served coffee to forgotten people in a neighborhood coffee shop, would cease to exist, leaving behind only memories of excellent lattes and a woman who had been kind to customers who needed kindness. Sofia Rivera, call sign Sierra, would disappear as well, fading back into whatever shadows elite soldiers retreated to when their wars were over. She had completed her mission, delivered her message, and eliminated a threat that had been growing in the darkness of legitimate society. The mouse had become a predator for one night, and that was enough. Now it was time to find a new place to hide, a new identity to construct, a new life to build in the spaces between other people's attention. Elena walked through empty streets, toward a future she hadn't planned, carrying nothing but the clothes on her back and the satisfaction of knowing that Vincent Chun would spend whatever remained of his freedom, looking over his shoulder, wondering when the ghost who had destroyed his empire might decide to return and finish what she had started. Some threats, Elena knew, were more effective when they remained invisible, lurking in the imagination rather than manifesting in reality. She had given Chun something to fear, and fear was often more destructive than violence. As dawn broke over the city, Elena boarded a bus headed toward another anonymous destination where she could disappear into the background of other people's lives. The hunt was over, the message had been delivered, and the mouse was free to find a new hole to hide in. But somewhere in the back of her mind, Sofia Rivera remained alert and ready, because Elena had learned that peace was always temporary, and predators had a way of finding prey no matter how well hidden it thought itself to be. The coffee girl who had been Delta Force was gone, but she would never really disappear. She would always be there, waiting in the shadows, ready to remind the world's monsters that some people were much more dangerous than they appeared to be. And Vincent Chun, if he survived the federal investigations that would soon consume his life, would spend his remaining years remembering the night when he learned that hunting ghosts was a game that only the dead could win. 6 months later, Elena Martinez stepped off a Greyhound bus in the small mountain town of Cedar Falls, Colorado, carrying everything she owned in a single duffel bag. The autumn air was crisp and thin, filled with the scent of pine trees and wood smoke from chimneys that had been awakened by the season's first cold snap. She had chosen Cedar Falls for the same reason she had chosen her previous hiding places. It was small enough that strangers were noticed, but too polite to be questioned, remote enough that people minded their own business, and poor enough that someone willing to work hard could find employment without extensive background checks. The town's main street stretched for exactly 4 blocks, lined with businesses that had been family-owned for generations and others that changed hands every few years as dreamers discovered that mountain charm didn't automatically translate to financial success. Elena walked past a hardware store that doubled as the town's unofficial community center, a diner that served breakfast all day because that's what the logging crews preferred, and a small grocery store where the same 3 cashiers had been working since the Clinton administration. At the end of the street, she found what she was looking for, a handwritten sign in the window of Murphy's Tavern that read, "Help wanted, kitchen staff, inquire within." The tavern occupied the ground floor of a two-story building that had been constructed sometime in the 1940s, with thick stone walls and windows that had been installed before energy efficiency became a concern. Through the glass, Elena could see a dimly lit interior filled with mismatched furniture and the kind of atmosphere that attracted people who preferred their drinking establishments to feel like living rooms rather than nightclubs. She pushed through the heavy wooden door and was immediately enveloped by warmth that carried the smell of grilled food, beer, and the accumulated conversations of decades. The interior was exactly what she had expected: dark wood paneling, a bar that had been carved from a single piece of oak, and enough character to make up for whatever it lacked in modern conveniences. Behind the bar, a woman in her 60s was drying glasses with practiced efficiency, while keeping one eye on a television that was broadcasting a college football game to an audience of 3 customers who looked like they had been there since noon. The woman had silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, hands that showed the wear of a lifetime spent in manual labor, and eyes that missed nothing despite their friendly warmth. "You hear about the job?" the woman asked without preamble, setting down her towel and giving Elena the kind of direct assessment that mountain people perfected through generations of having to judge character quickly and accurately. "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied, instinctively matching the woman's straightforward tone. "I'm looking for work, and I have kitchen experience." The woman extended her hand across the bar. "Sarah Murphy. This is my place, my kitchen, and my rules. You got references?" Elena shook Sarah's hand, noting the firm grip and calloused palms that spoke of someone who worked alongside her employees rather than simply managing them. "I'm Elena Martinez. I've been traveling, so my most recent references might be hard to reach, but I'm a hard worker, and I learn fast." Sarah studied Elena for a long moment, taking in the worn clothes, the careful posture, and the eyes that seemed older than the face that contained them. "You running from something or towards something?" The question was asked without judgment, the tone of someone who had seen enough of life to understand that people ended up in places like Cedar Falls for reasons that weren't always simple or pleasant. Elena appreciated the directness. "Both, I guess," Elena said honestly. "I'm looking for somewhere quiet where I can work and be left alone." Sarah nodded as if this answer made perfect sense. "Kitchen work is hard. Hours are long, pay isn't. Great, and you'll smell like French fry oil more often than you'll smell like perfume. You sure you're up for it?" "Unsure." "When can you start?" "Right now if you need me to." Sarah laughed, a sound that filled the tavern with genuine warmth. "I like that attitude. Tell you what, Elena Martinez, let's see how you handle the dinner rush tonight. If you can keep up with old Pete in the kitchen and don't burn down my building, we'll talk about making this permanent." Old Pete turned out to be a man in his 70s who had been cooking at Murphy's Tavern since before Sarah inherited the place from her father. He was barely 5 feet tall, moved with the economical precision of someone who had spent decades working in cramped spaces, and possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of every customer's preferences that stretched back to their childhoods. "New girl, huh?" Pete said when Sarah introduced Elena. "Hope you're tougher than you look. Friday night dinner rush in this place ain't for the weak-hearted." Elena tied on an apron that had seen better decades and took her position at the prep station Pete indicated. The kitchen was small, efficiently organized, and equipped with appliances that had been purchased when reliability mattered more than energy ratings. She spent the next hour learning Pete's system, which was based more on intuition and experience than any formal training, but produced food that kept customers coming back for generations. The dinner rush began at 6 o'clock when the day shift from the lumber mill arrived, followed by families who treated Murphy's Tavern as their weekly dining out tradition, and finally by the evening crowd who came for the atmosphere as much as the food. Elena found herself falling into a rhythm that felt familiar despite the new environment. Prep, cook, plate, clean, repeat. with the kind of focused intensity that left no room for thoughts about anything beyond the immediate task. "Behind you," Elena called out as she moved around Pete with a tray of finished orders, her voice carrying the automatic awareness of someone who understood that kitchen safety depended on constant communication. Pete grunted approval, a sound that Elena had learned to interpret as high praise from a man who saved actual words for emergencies. By 9 o'clock, the rush had subsided to a manageable pace, and Elena was cleaning her station with the same methodical thoroughness she brought to everything she did. Her clothes were soaked with sweat, her hands were stained with food and grease, and she felt more relaxed than she had in months. "Not bad for a first night," Pete admitted as he began shutting down his equipment. "You move like someone who's worked kitchens before." "A few different places," Elena said vaguely. "Different kinds of cooking, but the basics are the same everywhere." Pete studied her with the sharp eyes of someone who had supervised kitchen staff for half a century. "Most people who work kitchens do it because they have to. You do it like someone who understands that feeding people right is important work." Elena paused in her cleaning, touched by the observation. "I think it is important. People work hard. They deserve good food at the end of the day." "Exactly," Pete said, with satisfaction. "Sarah made a good choice hiring you." Elena settled into life in Cedar Falls with the same deliberate invisibility she had cultivated everywhere else, but this time felt different. The town was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business, but that familiarity bred a kind of protective discretion rather than gossip. People noticed that the new kitchen worker at Murphy's was quiet and competent, that she lived in the small apartment above the hardware store, and that she spent her free time reading at the library or hiking trails that had been worn smooth by generations of residents seeking solitude in the mountains. Elena's routine became as predictable as the sunrise. Morning walks through town while most people were still sleeping, afternoon shifts at the tavern, evenings spent in her apartment reading books she borrowed from the library's surprisingly comprehensive collection. She spoke when spoken to, smiled when appropriate, and gradually became part of the town's landscape in the way that useful people always did in small communities. The transformation wasn't immediate, but over the course of several months, Elena noticed something that hadn't happened in any of her previous hiding places. She began to care about the people around her. Sarah Murphy became more than just an employer, evolving into something resembling a mentor who offered advice about everything from cooking techniques to life philosophy. Pete shared stories about the town's history and the families who had called Cedar Falls home for generations. Regular customers at the tavern began to recognize Elena, asking about her day and including her in conversations about local events and concerns. For the first time since Cambodia, Elena felt like she might be building something that resembled a home rather than just another temporary shelter. The feeling lasted exactly 7 months and 12 days. Elena was closing the kitchen on a Tuesday night in late spring when she noticed the 3 men at the corner table who didn't belong in Murphy's Tavern. They wore clothes that were too expensive for the local economy, carried themselves with the kind of alert posture that suggested professional training, and observed the room with systematic thoroughness that had nothing to do with appreciating the atmosphere. Elena continued her closing routine without obvious reaction, but every instinct she had developed during 8 years of military service was suddenly active. She cataloged exit routes, noted potential weapons, and began calculating how quickly she could transition from kitchen worker to something much more dangerous if circumstances required it. One of the men stood up and approached the kitchen window where Elena was finishing her cleaning. He was tall, probably in his 40s, with graying hair and eyes that belonged on someone who had seen too much violence in too many places. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm looking for someone, and I was hoping you might be able to help me." Elena looked up from her cleaning, her expression maintaining the mild curiosity of someone who is accustomed to answering questions from customers. What can I do for you?" The man smiled, but it was a professional expression that didn't reach. His eyes, "I'm looking for a woman who might have worked in food service somewhere around here. Military background, very capable, probably going by a different name." Elena's hands continued their cleaning motions, but every muscle in her body was now coiled for action. "That's pretty vague. Can you be more specific?" Her name might be Sofia Rivera or Elena Vasquez or any number of other identities she's used over the years. She has a very particular skill set, and she's been quite difficult to locate. Elena set down her cleaning rag and looked directly at the man for the first time. "And who's looking for her?" The man's smile became more genuine, as if Elena had just passed some kind of test. "People who have a job offer that might interest her. People who understand what it means to serve your country, even when your country doesn't always appreciate the service." Elena glanced around the tavern, noting that Sarah was behind the bar and Pete had already left for the evening. The other two men were still seated at their table, but she could feel their attention focused on the conversation at the kitchen window. "I serve food," Elena said quietly. "That's all I do here." The man nodded as if he had expected this response. "Of course you do, and you're very good at it, from what I hear. But the thing is, Sofia, some talents are too valuable to waste in kitchens, no matter how good the food is." Elena felt the familiar cold sensation that meant her peaceful life was about to end again, that the identity she had carefully constructed was about to be discarded like all the others. But this time, something was different. This time, she had people she cared about who might be affected by whatever came next. "I think you have me confused with someone else," Elena said. But even as she spoke, she knew it was pointless. These men had found her despite every precaution she had taken, which meant they possessed resources and determination that went beyond ordinary criminal organizations. The man reached into his jacket slowly, telegraphing his movements to avoid triggering any defensive reactions. He produced a photograph and placed it on the counter where Elena could see it. A group shot of Delta Force operators after a successful mission, with Elena clearly visible among them. "Vincent Chun sends his regards," the man said quietly. "He wanted you to know that he survived your visit to his warehouse, and he's been very patient about planning his response." Elena stared at the photograph, recognizing faces of soldiers she had served with, people who had become family during the years when family meant the person who would die to keep you alive. Some of those faces belonged to people who were already dead, killed in operations that had never been officially acknowledged. Others belonged to ghosts like herself, people who had faded into civilian life and tried to forget what they had been trained to do. "Chun's in federal prison," Elena said. "Multiple life sentences, no possibility of parole." The man's smile widened. "Chun has friends, Sofia, friends who believe in paying debts, even when the debtor isn't available to pay them personally." Elena looked past the man to his companions, who were now standing and moving to block the tavern's exit routes. Sarah was still behind the bar, unaware that her quiet kitchen worker was about to become the center of violence that would shatter the peaceful evening like glass. "What do you want?" Elena asked, though she already knew the answer. "We want you to come with us," the man replied. Quietly, without involving any of these nice people in something that doesn't concern them. Elena glanced toward Sarah, who was watching the conversation with growing concern. The older woman had excellent instincts for trouble, and she was beginning to realize that something was happening in her tavern that went beyond ordinary customer service. "And if I refuse?" Elena asked. The man's expression didn't change, but his tone became colder. "Then we'll have to insist, and innocent people might get hurt in the process." Elena made her decision with the same clinical detachment she had used when planning military operations. She could comply and hope these men would honor their implied promise to leave Cedar Falls alone, or she could fight and risk turning Murphy's Tavern into a battlefield that might cost Sarah her life. But there was a third option, one that required her to remember exactly who Sofia Rivera had been before she became Elena Martinez. Elena reached under the counter as if she were retrieving something, her movements casual and unthreatening. What she actually retrieved was the emergency phone she had hidden there months ago, a device that connected directly to a network that officially didn't exist. "You know what your problem is?" Elena said conversationally as her fingers found the phone's activation sequence. "You assume that Sofia Rivera has been hiding because she's afraid." The man frowned, sensing that the conversation had taken an unexpected turn. "What are you talking about?" Elena's smile was nothing like the polite expression she had worn while serving customers for 7 months. This smile belonged to someone who had earned her place among the world's most elite soldiers, someone who had completed missions in places where failure meant death. "I haven't been hiding because I'm afraid of people like Vincent Chun," Elena said quietly. "I've been hiding because I'm afraid of what I might do to people like Vincent Chun if they push me too far." Elena activated the emergency phone, sending a signal that would be received by people who specialized in problems that required permanent solutions. Then she set the device on the counter where all 3 men could see it. "That signal just went out to every active and retired member of my old unit," Elena explained, her voice maintaining the same casual tone she might use to discuss the weather. "They know where I am, they know I'm in trouble, and they're already moving to provide assistance." The man's confident expression faltered slightly. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Elena asked. "How long do you think it takes Delta Force operators to respond to a distress call from one of their own? How many of them do you think are within driving distance of Cedar Falls, Colorado?" Elena could see uncertainty creeping into the man's eyes as he began to realize that the simple extraction mission he had planned was becoming something much more complicated. "Here's what's going to happen," Elena continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "You and your friends are going to walk out of this tavern, get in your car, and drive away from Cedar Falls as fast as your vehicle will carry you. You're going to report back to whoever sent you that Sofia Rivera wasn't here, that you made a mistake, that the trail went cold." The second man spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that suggested Eastern European origins. "And if we don't?" Elena's smile widened, and for the first time since these men had entered Murphy's Tavern, she looked genuinely happy. "Then you'll discover why Delta Force operators don't stay retired. They just get more creative about how they solve problems." As if summoned by her words, the tavern's front door opened to admit 2 men who definitely hadn't come to Cedar Falls for the atmosphere. They were both in their 30s, carried themselves with the fluid confidence of people who were comfortable with violence, and wore expressions that suggested they were here to collect a debt rather than enjoy an evening out. Elena recognized them immediately: Marcus Webb and Tommy Chun, former Delta Force operators who had transitioned to private security work after leaving the military. She had served with both men during her final deployment, trusted them with her life on multiple occasions, and knew that their presence meant her emergency signal had been received and acted upon with the efficiency that characterized everything Delta Force did. "Sofia," Marcus said casually as he approached the bar, "you look good. Kitchen work agrees with you." "Marcus," Elena replied with genuine warmth. "Tommy, you made good time." Tommy grinned as he positioned himself where he could observe all 3 of Chun's men simultaneously. "We were in Denver for another job when your signal came through. Seemed like a good opportunity to catch up with an old friend." The dynamic in the tavern had shifted completely. Chun's men were now outnumbered by operators who possessed superior training, better judgment, and absolute loyalty to the woman they had come to assist. More importantly, they were facing people who understood that some fights were worth having, regardless of the consequences. The lead man was reconsidering his options, his professional assessment of the situation telling him that what had seemed like a simple extraction was rapidly becoming a losing proposition. This doesn't have to escalate, he said carefully. Marcus laughed, a sound that held no humor whatsoever. Brother, it escalated the moment you walked into Sophia's workplace and threatened people she cares about. Now the only question is whether you leave here walking or whether we carry you out. Elena could see Sarah behind the bar, her eyes wide, with shock as she began to understand that her quiet kitchen worker was at the center of something that went far beyond ordinary criminal activity. The older woman was gripping a baseball bat she kept under the register, prepared to defend her establishment, despite having no idea what she was defending it against. Sarah, Elena said gently, would you mind calling Sheriff Davidson and asking him to come down here? Tell him we have some visitors who are about to leave town and might need an escort to make sure they don't get lost. Sarah nodded and reached for the phone, her hand steady despite the circumstances. Elena felt a surge of affection for the woman who had given her a job without asking questions and was now prepared to stand with her despite not understanding what was happening. The lead man was backing toward the door now, his companions following as they realized that their mission had become impossible. This isn't over, he said, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. Yes, it is, Elena replied firmly. Go back to whoever sent you and tell them that Sofia Rivera is under the protection of people who don't negotiate, don't compromise, and don't forgive threats against their own. Tell them that hunting ghosts is a game that only the dead can win. The three men left Murphy's Tavern without another word, their confident entrance replaced by a hasty retreat that spoke of professionals who had encountered something beyond their capabilities. Elena watched through the window as they climbed into a black SUV and drove away from Cedar Falls, their taillights disappearing into the mountain darkness. Marcus and Tommy remained for another hour, long enough to ensure that Chun's men had actually left the area and to catch up with Elena about their respective lives since leaving the military. They spoke in the shorthand of people who had shared experiences that couldn't be explained to civilians, using humor to process memories that were too intense for ordinary conversation. You know, Tommy said as he prepared to leave, there are other options besides hiding in small towns and serving food to strangers. Elena smiled, understanding what he was offering. I know, but this is good work, Tommy. These are good people. And they deserve someone who cares about doing the job right. And if more trouble comes looking for you. Elena glanced around Murphy's Tavern, taking in the familiar surroundings that had become more like home than anywhere she had lived since childhood. Then I'll deal with it, but I'm done running. After Marcus and Tommy left, Elena helped Sarah close the tavern and walked her to her car. The older woman had been unusually quiet since the confrontation, processing what she had witnessed with the practical wisdom of someone who had survived 7 decades in a world that wasn't always kind to decent people. Elena, Sarah said as she reached her vehicle, I don't need to know who you used to be or what you did before you came to Cedar Falls, but I want you to know that whatever it was, you're family now. This town is your home if you want it to be. Elena felt tears she hadn't shed in years threatening to spill as she realized that Sarah understood more than she had let on, that the older woman had recognized the signs of someone carrying invisible wounds and had chosen to offer healing rather than judgment. Thank you, Sarah. That means everything to me. Good. Now, I'm going to ask Sheriff Davidson to increase patrols around town for a few days, just to be safe. And Elena? Yes? Tomorrow night, I want you to train Pete's nephew to work the kitchen. It's time you learned the front of house operations too. Can't have my best employee stuck in the back forever. Elena laughed through her tears, understanding that Sarah was offering her a promotion, a deeper integration into the taverns operations, and a signal that her place in Cedar Falls was permanent if she wanted it to be. 6 months later, Elena Martinez stood behind the bar of Murphy's Tavern, serving drinks to customers who had become friends, managing employees who had become family, and living a life that felt real in ways she hadn't experienced since before. Cambodia. She had bought the small house on Maple Street, adopted a dog from the animal shelter, and even started dating the librarian who shared her love of books and mountain hiking. The legend of the coffee girl who had been Delta Force lived on in whispered stories that circulated through certain communities. Tales of a mouse who had revealed herself to be a predator, of a ghost who had reminded the world's monsters that some people were more dangerous than they appeared. But those stories belonged to someone Elena had been, not someone she was becoming. Sofia Rivera would always be there, waiting in the shadows of Elena's consciousness, ready to emerge if circumstances required the skills that had made her one of the world's most elite soldiers. But Elena Martinez was building a life that honored both identities, using the strength she had gained as Sofia to create the peace that Elena deserved. And in Murphy's Tavern, surrounded by people who valued her for who she chose to be rather than who she had been forced to become, Elena finally understood that home wasn't a place you found, but a life you built with people who saw the best in you and helped you see it in yourself. The mouse had stopped running. The predator had found peace. And the woman who contained both had discovered that sometimes the greatest victory was simply being allowed to live quietly among people who cared whether you made it home safely at the end of the day. Elena's hands were steady as she poured coffee for the morning shift at the lumber mill, but her mind was elsewhere. 3 weeks had passed since Marcus and Tommy had dealt with Chun's men, and the quiet that followed felt different from the peace she had grown accustomed to in Cedar Falls. The silence carried weight, like the stillness before a thunderstorm, that everyone could feel but nobody wanted to acknowledge. The bell above Murphy's front door chimed, and Elena looked up to see a woman entering alone. She was tall, elegant in the way that came from expensive clothes and professional confidence, with silver hair cut in a style that probably cost more than Elena made in a month. Everything about her screamed federal government, from her practical shoes to the way she surveyed the room with trained observation skills. "Coffee?" Elena asked as the woman approached the bar, though something in her gut told her this wasn't going to be a simple transaction. "Agent Catherine Walsh, FBI," the woman said quietly, producing credentials that looked legitimate. "I'd like to speak with Elena Martinez if that's convenient." Elena continued wiping down the bar, her movements unhurried despite the adrenaline that was beginning to flood her system. "That's me. What can I do for you, Agent Walsh?" Walsh glanced around the nearly empty tavern, noting the few early customers who were absorbed in their newspapers and breakfast. "Perhaps we could speak privately?" "This is as private as it gets around here," Elena replied. "Sarah's in the back doing inventory, and these gentlemen don't pay attention to anything that doesn't involve sports scores or lumber prices." Walsh nodded and took a seat at the bar, accepting the cup of coffee Elena poured without being asked. "Vincent Chun is dead." Elena's expression didn't change, but she felt something shift inside her chest, a mixture of relief and concern that she couldn't quite identify. "I'm sorry to hear that. Natural causes?" "Prison stabbing. Very professional, very clean. The kind of thing that happens when someone wants to send a message without leaving fingerprints." Elena set down her cleaning rag and looked directly at Walsh. "And you're telling me this because?" "Because 3 weeks ago, Chun's associates made inquiries about your whereabouts. Those same associates disappeared shortly after visiting Cedar Falls. Their abandoned vehicle was found in Denver, but there's been no trace of them since." Elena poured herself a cup of coffee, taking time to consider her response. "That sounds like a problem for local law enforcement." Walsh smiled thinly. "The thing is, Elena, we've been watching Vincent Chun's organization for 2 years. We know about the warehouse fire. We know about the evidence packages that were anonymously delivered to multiple federal agencies. And we know about a certain barista who used to work at Sunrise Coffee." "I've never worked at a coffee shop," Elena said truthfully. "I'm kitchen staff." "Of course you are." Walsh took a sip of her coffee, her expression suggesting she was genuinely impressed by the quality. Here's the interesting part, though. When we investigated Chun's operation, we found evidence that had been compiled with the kind of precision and attention to detail that suggested military intelligence training. The person who put together those files understood surveillance techniques, evidence preservation, and operational security at a level that goes far beyond civilian capabilities. Elena felt the familiar sensation of walls closing in, of carefully constructed identities beginning to crumble under professional scrutiny. Sounds like Chun had some sophisticated enemies. Indeed he did. Walsh set down her cup and leaned forward slightly. The problem is, Elena, that person also demonstrated a willingness to use explosives, conduct unauthorized surveillance, and eliminate threats through methods that violated numerous federal laws. Are you here to arrest me, Agent Walsh? Walsh was quiet for a long moment, studying Elena with eyes that had seen enough to recognize truth when it was presented without embellishment. That depends on what you want to do next. I want to keep working here, serving food to good people, and living a quiet life that doesn't bother anyone. And if more of Chun's associates decide to look for you. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. Then they'll discover that some problems solve themselves. Walsh nodded as if this answer confirmed something she had already suspected. Here's what I think happened. Elena, I think Sofia Rivera completed a mission in Cambodia that went sideways through no fault of her own. I think she was quietly reassigned to protect people who made decisions they didn't want to be held accountable for. I think she eventually decided that serving her country didn't require her to sacrifice her principles. Elena remained silent, but something in her posture suggested Walsh was getting closer to the truth than previous investigators had managed. I think Sofia Rivera disappeared because she understood that some fights are worth having, even when your own government decides. They're inconvenient. I think she spent 18 months documenting Vincent Chun's criminal enterprise because she believed that protecting innocent people was more important than following bureaucratic protocols. Walsh finished her coffee and placed a business card on the bar. The Bureau has a task force that specializes in organized crime operations that require unconventional approaches. We need people who understand that sometimes the right thing to do isn't the legal thing to do. Elena picked up the card, noting the phone number and the small symbol in the corner that indicated Walsh represented something beyond ordinary. FBI operations. And what would someone like Sofia Rivera do in a position like that? She'd hunt monsters, Walsh said simply. The kind of monsters that hide behind legitimate businesses and political connections. The kind that ordinary law enforcement can't touch because they're too smart, too connected, or too careful to be caught through conventional methods. Elena slipped the card into her pocket, though she made no commitment about whether she would ever use it. Hypothetically, what would prevent this task force from making the same mistakes that led to Cambodia? Walsh's expression grew serious. Because this time, Sofia Rivera would be making the decisions about which missions to accept and how to complete them. No more impossible orders from politicians who don't understand the consequences. No more being asked to compromise principles for the sake of operational convenience. Sarah emerged from the back room, carrying boxes of supplies, nodding politely to Walsh before beginning to restock the bar area. Elena watched her employer work with the same efficient grace that had characterized everything she did and realized that whatever decision she made would affect more than just her own future. Agent Walsh, Elena said quietly, hypothetically speaking, if someone like Sofia Rivera were interested in your task force, would she be required to relocate? She could work from anywhere she chose as long as she was available when needed. Remote operations, flexible schedule, minimal supervision. Elena looked around Murphy's Tavern, taking in the familiar surroundings that had become more like home than anywhere she had lived since childhood. And the people she cared about would be protected? The full resources of the federal government, Walsh confirmed. Anyone who threatened Sofia Rivera's personal life would discover that some people have very long reaches and very good memories. Elena made her decision with the same clinical detachment she had used when planning military operations. She could continue hiding in Cedar Falls, serving food and pretending that Sofia Rivera no longer existed. Or she could find a way to honor both identities, using the skills that had made her an elite soldier to protect people who deserved protection. "Tell me about the monsters," Elena said. Walsh smiled for the first time since entering the tavern. "There's a human trafficking operation in Miami that's been untouchable for 5 years, because the people running it have federal judges in their pockets. There's a weapons dealer in Chicago who's been selling military-grade equipment to terrorist organizations while hiding behind diplomatic immunity. There's a pharmaceutical company that's been testing dangerous drugs on homeless populations because they know nobody will investigate deaths among people society has already forgotten." Elena felt something stirring in her chest that she hadn't experienced since Cambodia, a sense of purpose that went beyond personal survival or peaceful anonymity. These were the kind of enemies worth fighting, the kind of battles that mattered regardless of who won or lost the larger war. "How would this work?" Elena asked. Walsh reached into her jacket and produced a small device that looked like an ordinary smartphone. Encrypted communication, unlimited resources, and complete operational autonomy. You choose the targets, you plan the missions, you decide how to complete them. The only requirement is results. Elena accepted the device, noting its weight and the subtle modifications that suggested capabilities beyond civilian electronics. "And if I wanted to maintain my current life while doing this work?" Elena Martinez continues to work at Murphy's Tavern, lives in her house on Maple Street, and dates the librarian who makes her happy. Sofia Rivera handles special assignments that require her particular expertise. 2 identities, 1 person. Complete separation between personal and professional activities. Elena looked at Sarah, who was pretending not to listen while obviously paying attention to every word of the conversation. The older woman caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that said she understood more than she let on and supported whatever decision Elena needed to make. "When would this start?" Elena asked. "Whenever you're ready. The first assignment is in Miami, but it doesn't require immediate attention. You could take time to make arrangements here, ensure your personal life remains stable." Elena slipped the device into her pocket next to Walsh's business card, feeling the weight of decisions that would define the rest of her life. Agent Walsh, hypothetically speaking, if Sofia Rivera were to accept this position, would she have backup when she needed it? "Marcus Webb and Tommy Chun have already agreed to serve as your support team," Walsh said with a slight smile. "Apparently, they're quite fond of their former colleague and would be happy to work with her again." Elena laughed softly, understanding that her old unit numbers had been planning this conversation long before Walsh had walked into Murphy's Tavern. "They always were good at anticipating my decisions. Is that a yes?" Elena looked around the tavern one more time, seeing it with new eyes as both a sanctuary she could always return to and a base of operations for work that might actually matter. "That's a yes, Agent Walsh, but I have conditions. Name them." "Cedar Falls remains off limits to anyone connected with federal operations. My personal life stays personal. My friends and family are never used as leverage, and I maintain final authority over mission parameters." Walsh extended her hand across the bar. "Welcome back to active duty, Sofia Rivera." Elena shook the agent's hand, feeling the weight of commitment that came with accepting responsibility for battles that others couldn't or wouldn't fight. "It's good to be back." After Walsh left, Elena continued her morning routine while processing the magnitude of what she had agreed to. She would serve food to good people, live quietly in a town that had become home, and hunt monsters that hid in the shadows of legitimate society. The mouse had found her voice. The predator had found her purpose. And the woman who contained both had discovered that sometimes the greatest service you could provide was using your darkness to protect other people's light. Sofia Rivera was back, but this time she would be fighting for people who mattered, in ways that honored both her training and her principles. 2 years later, Elena stood in the kitchen of Murphy's Tavern, training her replacement for the evening shift. Jenny was 19, fresh out of high school, and eager to learn from the woman everyone in Cedar Falls considered the best cook in town. Elena watched the girl practice knife techniques with the same patient attention she brought to everything, offering corrections and encouragement in equal measure. The secret isn't speed, Elena explained as Jenny struggled with onion prep. It's rhythm. Find your rhythm, and speed comes naturally. Through the kitchen window, Elena could see the tavern's evening crowd settling in for dinner. Regular faces, familiar conversations, the comfortable routine of a community that had accepted her completely. Sheriff Davidson was sharing war stories with old Pete, who had finally agreed to semi-retirement. Sarah Murphy was behind the bar, dispensing wisdom along with drinks to customers who treated her establishment like a second home. Elena's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. Package delivered in Miami. Problem solved permanently. SR. She deleted the message without reading it twice. 3 days ago, Sofia Rivera had eliminated a trafficking operation that had destroyed hundreds of lives. Tonight, Elena Martinez was teaching a teenager how to cook properly for people who mattered. Both identities served the same purpose now, protecting innocence wherever it could be found. Elena, Jenny said, holding up her knife work for inspection. How did you get so good at this? Elena smiled, thinking about all the skills that had brought her to this moment. Practice. Lots of practice, and understanding that some things are worth doing right. The front door chimed, and Marcus Webb entered wearing civilian clothes and a genuine smile. He'd been in town for a week, ostensibly visiting friends, but actually providing support for Elena's latest assignment. The Miami operation had required careful coordination, and Marcus had handled the logistics while Elena handled the elimination. Evening, ladies, Marcus said, approaching the kitchen window. Something smells incredible back there. Jenny made the special tonight, Elena replied, pride evident in her voice. She's got real talent. Jenny beamed at the praise, unaware that the quiet compliment came from someone whose approval was earned through standards that had been forged in the world's most dangerous places. Marcus ordered dinner and took a seat at the bar next to Tommy Chun, who was pretending to be interested in the baseball game while actually monitoring communications from their handler. To anyone watching, they looked like friends catching up over drinks. In reality, they were elite operators maintaining overwatch for a colleague who had found the perfect balance between duty and happiness. Elena's personal phone rang, the librarian, calling to confirm their dinner plans for tomorrow night. She answered with genuine warmth, discussing movies and hiking trails with someone who knew nothing about her professional activities and didn't need to. That separation was sacred now, a boundary she maintained to protect both identities. I have to go, Elena told Jenny as closing time approached. You did excellent work tonight. Same time Thursday? Jenny nodded enthusiastically, already planning improvements to tomorrow's prep work. Elena removed her apron and hung it on the hook where it would wait for her return, a symbol of continuity in a life that had finally found its proper rhythm. Outside, Marcus and Tommy were waiting by their rental car. They would drive to Denver tonight, catch a flight to Washington for debriefing, then return to their respective lives until the next assignment required their particular expertise. Miami was clean, Marcus reported. No loose ends, no complications. The girls from that operation are being relocated through proper channels. Elena nodded, satisfied that another monster had been eliminated without collateral damage. Good. What's next? Rest, Tommy said firmly. Walsh says you've earned some quiet time before the next mission. Elena looked back at Murphy's Tavern, where Sarah was locking up after another successful evening. The older woman waved goodnight, a gesture that encompassed acceptance, affection, and the kind of unconditional support that Elena had never expected to find. I think I'd like that, Elena said. Marcus and Tommy drove away into the mountain darkness, carrying with them the satisfaction of work completed and friends protected. Elena walked home through streets that belonged to her now, past houses where people slept safely, because someone was willing to hunt the monsters that threatened their peace. At her front door, Elena paused to look back at the town that had given her everything she'd never known she wanted. Cedar Falls slept peacefully under stars that seemed brighter here than anywhere else she'd lived. A community of good people who deserved protection they would never know they were receiving. Inside, Elena fed her dog, checked her secure communications one final time, and prepared for sleep in a bed that felt like home. Tomorrow she would serve food to neighbors who had become family. Next week, Sofia Rivera might eliminate threats that ordinary people couldn't imagine. Tonight, Elena Martinez was exactly where she belonged, in the space between two worlds, protecting both with equal dedication. The mouse had become a guardian. The predator had found purpose, and the woman who contained both had discovered that some battles were worth fighting forever, especially when you had something worth fighting for. The legend of the coffee girl who was Delta Force would continue to grow, whispered in certain circles as a reminder that heroes often wore ordinary faces. But the truth was simpler and more profound, sometimes the greatest. Victory was learning that you could be both dangerous and gentle, feared and loved, a weapon and a healer. Elena had found her balance. The rest was just details. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.